Excellent. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm not entirely sure who chose that welcome music, but I think it's the perfect way to set the tone for what's going to be an exciting and maybe a little bit jazzy and slightly improvised event. So as I mentioned, welcome. This is the inaugural Humans of New Mobility event. And I am Julia Thane. I'm a principal of urban transformation at the Global Climate Action nonprofit RMI. I'm a co-founder and board member of Urban Movement Labs, the organization that is hosting this webinar. And today I will be your moderator for our discussion on electric and shared mobility. For those of you who aren't familiar with Urban Movement Labs, it is an LA-based nonprofit organization that works with communities, companies, and governments to accelerate equitable, innovative, and sustainable transportation solutions that most importantly meet people's needs. Humans of New Mobility is our first event series, and I'm incredibly excited to share that we partnered with Siemens, the global infrastructure and technology giant, and actually my former employer, on this event series, and an event series that we really see as giving voice to the diverse users, providers, and creators of new mobility, not just in LA, but really worldwide. We don't like to do anything traditionally at Urban Movement Labs, so we haven't structured this as a traditional webinar. We're going to have some welcoming remarks, a discussion on shared mobility, a discussion on electric mobility, and finally, question and answers across all of the panelists. Throughout, and as part of our testing out of new platforms, we're going to be using a digital whiteboard on a platform called Miro. So the link will be in the chat, and you can see Jorge has shared his screen to show you what that Miro whiteboard looks like. We invite you to interact during the panel and answer questions about electric and shared mobility. I also invite you to use the Q&A function within Zoom to ask questions of the panelists, and we will be answering those at the end. So please do use both and look forward to having this exciting conversation. Without further ado, I am going to mute myself and hand this over to Paul Musto, who's the Portfolio Development Director at Siemens Digital Industry Software, to share with us a few words of welcome. So Paul, take it away.
Thank you, Julia. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Musto, and I'm part of the Siemens Digital Industry Software Organization, responsible for supporting small and medium-sized companies and startups across North and South America. Over the years, I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with many startup companies and organizations who are leading innovation and change in emerging markets, such as this fast-changing world of transportation and mobility that we're here to talk about today. There's a tremendous amount of innovation in the space that will dramatically change the way we get from place to place in the future, whether it's just short distances or long distances. Over the past couple of years, we've already seen a few major changes as we're facing pressure around more environmentally friendly and sustainable technologies. Siemens is incredibly proud to be partnering with Urban Movement Labs to sponsor the Humans of New Mobility webinar series. Over the past year, I've gotten to know the folks at UML, and I've gained a deep appreciation for their passion and dedication to driving a future of accessible and eco-friendly mobility. This, of course, requires more than just new technology. It requires partnerships, collaboration, infrastructure development across multiple industries, government agencies, and equally as important, across our communities. I'm extremely excited about the team that we have assembled for today's webinar. They represent these cross-functional areas and are leaders in their respective fields. Best yet, from speaking with them yesterday, they are extraordinarily passionate about leading change for new sustainable and accessible forms of transportation. With that, I just want to thank you again for attending. Special thanks to all our panelists, Urban Movement Labs for hosting, and very much to Julia Thane for being our moderator. Thank you, and I hope this is informative and enjoyable for you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Paul, again, for your partnership and also for these wonderful words that, again, set the tone for what we'll be talking about right now. So I'm going to be inviting to the virtual stage for our first conversation about shared mobility, two literal luminaries in the industry. So first, we have Robin Chase, who's the founder of the New Urban Mobility Alliance, and who many of us know as the person who really defined the term shared mobility for all of us, as well as my fellow Urban Movement Labs board member, Vice President of Digital Innovation at AECOM, Veronica Cyranosian. And Veronica, I'm going to ask you first briefly to just tell us about your work on shared mobility at AECOM and otherwise, and also why you think it's so critical to the future of our cities.
Absolutely. Thanks, Julia, and thanks for having me. So yes, I'm a vice president at AECOM focused on digital and innovation. My background is transportation planning. So everything I work on is at the intersection of emerging technology and transportation. I'm based in Oakland now, but I grew up in LA, and I'm really proud to have worked on some of the very early work in Los Angeles on shared mobility. So I worked on some of the mobility hubs needs assessment and operating plan for LA Metro, which was way back before we had bike share, e-scooters and all of that. And it was funded by an FTA Jobs Access Reverse Commute Grant. And one of the interesting things about that project is that we had to convince the FTA that bike share, car share, ride hailing could form part of the public transit network. And we were able to do that and get the full funding grant agreement for that. And now we have a much more rich micro mobility transit all coming together in LA. AECOM also works on vehicle electrification and transportation decarbonization nationally. So we're leading deployment planning for some of the national electric vehicle infrastructure programs nationally, and also support emerging technologies like inductive wireless charging. And of course, AECOM is a global infrastructure and architecture firm. So we work on designing infrastructure that supports shared mobility. For example, we supported Transport for London when they wanted to do really quick cycle lanes all across London during the pandemic to transition to enable people to use shared active mobility more. And so we supported them with that, and of course support shared mobility and complete streets globally. When thinking about why this topic is so important for me, I really think of the promise for shared micromobility and electric vehicles to support equity. So for example, we know that there are different rates of usage among the genders for things like bike share. Research from NYU showed that women tended to use bike share in New York in less dense areas with lower rates of traffic. And we know, for example, data from Populous shows that e-scooters are more heavily used by women than, for example, shared bikes. So there are gender differences. There are also income differences. For example, that same data set from Populous showed that lower income people were more prone and supportive of dockless electric scooters than they were of docked bikes that tended to have monthly membership requirements. So from an equity perspective, from an accessibility perspective, from a sustainability perspective, I really think this topic is critical, and I'm really excited to be on this panel discussing this with you all today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Veronica. And Robin, I'd invite you to do the same, actually with a slightly different flavor on it, which is to tell us a little bit more about your work at New Urban Mobility Alliance, but also to do so in the context of what shared and electric mobility really means. You know, what are the definitions of those things, and how are those definitions in tension with each other, and how are they synergies?
So I'm Robin Chase. I'm coming on more than 2 decades of work in transportation now. And it was when I first founded Zipcar and thought about it, I thought, oh my God, transportation is the center of the universe. And I became completely infatuated with it. It's our gateway to all opportunity. After Zipcar, I tried my hand at a failed real ride sharing company, going from point to point together in a car. And then I did peer-to-peer car sharing company. I've done a vehicle network communications company. And most recently, I co-founded my first NGO, NUMO, the New Urban Mobility Alliance, because what I saw happening was new transportation innovations were disrupting cities around the world. And there was active conversation going on between users, regulators, policymakers, the companies doing it. And I thought, wow, this is an opportunity that everyone's feeling. I feel like transportation mostly evaporates. You don't think of it unless it's bad, and then you focus. And whereas we all know it's so much more important. So NUMO is really working to pull together all the stakeholders to work to talk about and think about the impact of these disruptions in cities, and to create, just as you suggested, livable, sustainable, and just cities in the future. Like, we have this opportunity. Let's figure out where we want to go and really focus in on making that happen. The issue and the tension between electric and shared mobility is kind of interesting to me. About 5 years ago, a colleague of mine was asking me what I thought the future of transportation would be. And my word was shared. And they were quite disappointed with me that I hadn't answered electric. And so I just want to touch on this shared as, for me, the dominant and transforming piece of technology or opportunity, because it puts us immediately into a multimodal and resilient framework where there's much more access. If it's not shared, you have to own your own thing, which is typically a car in our society. And that means you have to have a driver's license. You have to have a lot of money, and you have to have all the parking spaces. So shared, for me, if we think about a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future, really delivers that much more so than private car ownership. Electric mobility, I am delighted and in love with, as long as we talk about electric vehicles as a whole suite and range of vehicles. So from some crazy electric one-wheel thing that you see to e-scooters, e-bikes, whatever I hadn't thought of, e-golf carts, e-tuk-tuks, up to electric buses and electric trains. That electrification, we know, is critical in terms of addressing our air quality and climate change issues. And it does pose with it charging issues. But again, I feel like the larger transformative power in terms of quality of life in cities has to do with the shared and what opportunities that opens up as we get rid of or minimize the large numbers of privately stored cars on our streets and how much space they take up. So I'll stop there and we'll go to our great discussion.
Yeah. And actually, that's a perfect way to jump off on our discussion. I mean, Robin, what you're saying about shared mobility is the transformative piece of the puzzle. It is what we should be focusing on. I'm curious, actually, Veronica, to get your take on this. Do you see it the same way? Why? You know, who doesn't see it the same way, and who should see it the same way?
Yeah, I think in terms of kind of this tension between shared versus not shared, when thinking about the hierarchy of transportation modes, my ideal would be that all, if not most, trips could be served by shared modes. So whether that be high capacity transit, or as Robin was saying, any number of shared micro-mobility devices. And I think in terms of what to promote, we should always promote focusing on shared mobility. We know in the US, there's a huge opportunity to shift, hopefully, a lot of trips to shared modes. According to the National Highway Travel Survey in the US, almost 60% of trips are less than 6 miles. And so to me, a lot of those short trips could be more sustainably served by shared modes, whether that's transit or micromobility. But we also know, and there's been some really interesting research specifically on Los Angeles around this, that a vehicle or access to a vehicle can support economic opportunities. So research from Evelyn Blumenberg at the UCLA Lewis Center finds that people with cars are more able to access better neighborhoods, they're more likely to find a job, and they're more likely to keep a job. And again, what I found quite shocking data from LA was that, for example, residents of Watts in LA with cars have access to 59 times more jobs than residents that rely on public transit alone. So while for me, the ideal is high capacity shared modes, those should come first. Until we have a transportation and land use network in Los Angeles that has that very strong foundation, that all people, no matter where they live, have that convenient, frequent, accessible, and equitable access to mobility, then I do think vehicles could have a role to play in our mobility system to maximize that access, opportunity, and freedom. But for me, even when thinking about vehicle access, I still think that that's a place to promote sharing. So for example, LA has had the Blue LA EV car share program. I think that's a great example. And so any work we do in terms of expanding access towards vehicles could still be done within the context of a shared multimodal mobility system. And I think needs to be done simultaneously with continuing to advocate for and build out our shared high capacity transit system.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. And I'm sure many of the people on the webinar would agree with you, Veronica, but at the moment, privately owned electric vehicles are gaining attention. They're gaining investment from the private sector and the government. And that's not a question, that's a statement. I mean, it's just factually correct that more money is going into EVSE or EV charging infrastructure and electric vehicles than into shared mobility. Again, both from a government spending level and from capital markets. So Robin, I'm going to pose this question to you. I mean, kind of building on some of what Veronica said, what do you think are the consequences of supporting privately owned electric vehicles or just electric vehicles overall without considering a shared multimodal approach? Is that what we're doing right now, or are we actually doing okay? I mean, give us a grade.
Oh,
Oh no!
I'm known to be very honest. So I would
yeah.
say C minus. So what I feel like we're doing with the money that's being put on the table is we are regenerating old and aging fleet and rejuvenating an auto industry and giving them a heft for the next 15 to 20 years, whereas the future should have those both shrinking. And so I find it a disappointing and not a great start to how we're going to address equity and sustainability issues. I'd rather people continued on with their old personally owned fleets while we amplified the numbers of ways you can get around without that. And something that Veronica had said, I just wanted to push a little, amplify a little more, is when we talk about in LA, which I don't know a lot about, so I'll be very careful of not saying wrong things, that people had greater economic opportunity when they owned a car. You guys will all recognize these maps that say, you know, how many jobs can you access by walking for 30 minutes? And how many jobs can you access biking for 30 minutes? And then how many can you access with electric bikes? And I was just reading, and I'm so sorry I don't remember just today I was reading about a city where, since the topic of this discussion includes electric bikes, the difference between bikes and electric bikes was this gigantic amplification of distance that you can go. And whenever we talk about transportation, I mean, density really matters, and there's a whole range of density, clearly. But the fascinating part about electric bikes is that it takes you another amplification in geography out without the skill or fear of or around whether I'm strong enough or athletic enough. So I just wanted to point that out. Yeah, so I feel disappointed that we're doubling down on electric vehicles as if that were the solution. And that's just, it doesn't, I didn't put any slides, we're not doing any slides, but I have a favorite slide from literally 18 years ago that was, here's the second order effects from cars. You guys all have your own list. And now we're taking away we're crossing off of that list air quality and climate change, but every other second order effect remains strong. Whereas sharing and shared vehicles and a multimodal way of approaching our transportation needs really knocks a lot of things off of that list.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point to lead into my next two questions. The first of which is really going to be about behavior, and the second more about private ownership versus shared mobility. Veronica, some of the things that you were saying around how we should really be pushing for shared mobility, that should be primarily the answer. I take issue with to a certain extent, and I'll tell you why. I think one of the issues that we've had with both shared and electric mobility and with transportation overall is this idea of behavior shift rather than behavior matching. I think we've done a really shitty job as an industry about talking about how mobility options can actually be supportive of people's mobility needs, rather than sort of, saying that people should avoid privately owned electric vehicles and should go into transit instead. And even just in LA, I mean, of course, probably many people on the webinar know that when the pandemic happened, we had some of the highest transit ridership numbers in the entire US. And that was because we had a transit dependent population. And now transit ridership in LA is recovering faster than in other markets for the same reason. And so, a lot of what we're doing in terms of transportation planning and transportation provision in LA on the shared side is really about making sure that those folks' real needs are being met. So let me get to my question, which is, Veronica, when you think about sort of shared and electric mobility, how do you think about it, not just in the form of behavior shift, but really more in the form of behavior matching? And how, for that matter, are AECOM and Urban Movement Labs thinking about that too?
I think it's a great question. And yeah, well, personally, I might think like the hierarchy should focus on shared first. Sometimes I think in terms of behavior matching, our job is really to maximize mobility freedom and mobility choice. And so sometimes people's needs don't align with, let's say, getting on a bus. And actually, I have an anecdote from that project I mentioned, the Mobility Hubs Needs Assessment and Operating Plan that we did for Metro. We did a whole LA countywide GIS data analysis, and in many places found that there was a transit gap. People were shift workers, especially, were working odd hours. And one of the solutions we came up was, well, bike share would be great. It's on demand. It's always there. It's a relatively low investment. And maybe we could put bike share in these various locations. And when we went out and did outreach, some of the feedback that we received was, no, like I can't, this was before wide scale kind of deployment or availability of e-bikes, but I can't cart my groceries on bike share. I can't take my children to the doctor on bike share. I can't take my older adult family members on bike share. And so what we recognized was it was better to have a more wider set of multimodal options at those stations that could meet, like you're saying, Julia, meet people's needs where they are. And so, yes, they could take bike share if and when that made sense. But we also had, at the time we were calling it jitney services proposed in certain stations so that people had essentially van pool that could take them around the service zone, so that if they needed to travel with older adults, children, or groceries, they could do that. So I think when thinking about mobility, yes, we may want to make certain modes like privately owned gas vehicles more expensive or more difficult to access, and maybe try to nudge people towards more sustainable modes. I think in terms of meeting people's needs, as transportation professionals, we need to recognize what those needs are and provide a suite of services to provide people mobility freedom.
I like that phrase, mobility freedom. I think it's a great way of thinking about it. Robin, to get to this point around private ownership and shared mobility, I wish I also had in front of me, or maybe as my background, two charts. One that showed car ownership and car vehicle miles traveled in different countries. And then the other one that showed bike ownership and bike miles traveled in different countries. And the pattern that you see reflected in both is that the higher levels of ownership result in higher miles traveled by those different modes. So whether you own a car or whether you own a bike, you're actually going to use it more. Yeah. Does that make sense to you? I mean, especially, given this emphasis on shared, like I don't know, I'm starting to think like, should we just be pushing for private ownership of micromobility and all sorts of shared electric, or not shared, but zero emissions mobility options?
Oh, there's so many things to answer here. One of the key differences between owned private cars and a panoply of shared services is sunk costs. When you own your own car, the only determination you make is, does it have any fuel in it? And can I park? And then you just get it every time you open your door, that's what you get into and you go. You never make an economic judgment about which mode choice you should be using. And in dense urban areas, that's a real problem. And so I want to just touch on Veronica's statement about freedom of mobility, and I was really struck by your shift versus matching binary. Is we used to have a human right of freedom of mobility, that a person could go out their front door and with no money and with no driver's license and no government regulation, I could get someplace and get to my essential services. And as we have layered in over the last 100 years, car infrastructure, we have ripped away that ability to make a choice other than go by car, because everything else was less convenient and unsafe and expensive. So just that I just want to point out, infrastructure is destiny. And the infrastructure we built out in terms of fixed road, highway, and transit infrastructure, that really determines, can I make those other choices? And that infrastructure is destiny also applies to car ownership. If I own that car, it's like my own personal infrastructure. And so I do choose that. Which is why I'm very interested in when we have multimodal optionality, and if we can, how can we make people feel the actual costs of private car ownership, and how can we make them pay for some of the externalities, because then we would all personally transform our daily decisions if we had that on us. And I would like us to have this emphasis on freedom of mobility. We have taken away people's freedom of mobility. You have very, very few choices right now. And how can we bring more choices back in there so it's not shift versus match? Because my match is without choice.
Right, not a match at all. And I think infrastructure's destiny might need to become Siemens' new tagline as an infrastructure company. Let me ask one final question and before we wrap up this excellent discussion. And that is really like, help us imagine in a few sentences, what's the opportunity here? What's the best case scenario if we make electric mobility shared? How does that manifest in our cities? And Veronica, yeah, Veronica, I'll go with you first.
I think that means that if we make electric mobility shared, I think it means that we continue to maximize, like we're saying, the multimodal options, and when they are gas powered, because already a lot of the shared mobility isn't, and we already have legislation in California that will take most of our transit fleets electric in the coming decades, that the leftovers get to be more sustainable. But I agree with Robin that the emphasis should be on the shared part. And if that shared part is also electric, that just means that we're moving faster towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and hopefully mitigating some of the impacts that we've already had on climate change.
I want to add something we haven't touched here, which is one of the huge, most gigantic, there's so many good attributes of shared mobility, but in land use. And so for Zipcar, Susan Shaheen has done her research. Each Zipcar replaces 16 privately owned cars. And we all know that each privately owned cars has 3 to 5 parking places associated with it. So our cities would be completely transformed if we didn't have to store all of those blasted cars on street or provide parking spaces for that number of them. If we could right size our transportation needs and provide this more multimodal approach, our cities would be transformed because the number of cars servicing our mobility resilient and access desires would be such a fraction of what it is today that our cities would be totally different. They would have more grass, more bike lanes, more fun street cafes, more whatever great thing you want to think about, more cheaper housing, all of those things if you didn't have to have all that car storage associated.
Yeah, that's a great way to end this particular part of the discussion. So thank you so much, Robin and Veronica. We're going to unpin you, but we'll have you stick around and no puns intended in either of those through the end of the webinar to be able to answer audience questions. Please, everyone in the audience, continue to feel free to post questions in the Zoom Q&A and also to interact with our digital whiteboard, which the link to which was in the chat. So next up is going to be our discussion on electric mobility. And I'm going to welcome to the panel Alejandra Alvarez, who's the project manager at the LA County Bicycle Coalition. Welcome, Ale. Michael Samuelon, who's the director of vehicle electrification at the mayor's office in Los Angeles, and Nand Kochar, who's the vice president for automotive and transportation industry at Siemens Digital. So Ale, I'm going to ask you to first briefly just tell us about your work on electric mobility and how it's driving impact in LA.
Absolutely. Thank you for that welcome. Again, my name is Alejandra. I'm with the Los Angeles County Bicycle Coalition, project manager. I oversee our e-bike pilot incentive project, in which we are bringing e-bikes to communities that are highly polluted. You know, the air quality is poor. And what we're doing is we're trying to incentivize small businesses and independently contracted delivery drivers to ditch their vehicles and use our e-bikes to conduct their deliveries. And what we're finding is that folks in the community are already experiencing so many of the benefits of moving to electric e-bikes. And I can't wait to share a little bit more about that with you all.
Fantastic. Nand, could you tell us a little bit more about the work that Siemens is doing on e-mobility?
Yes, thank you for having me over. I'm Nand Kocher, I'm Vice President, Automotive and Transportation Industry at Siemens. We help automotive and transportation industry provide with the product lifecycle management solutions. We follow the key trends from a consumer standpoint. And some of the key trends in the industry are around autonomous vehicle and electrification. So we offer our solutions to enable the electrification as related to this context we are talking here. And we serve what we call subsegments of the industry, which covers from cars, trucks, buses, to motorcycles, e-bikes, scooters, and even going up to railway systems. So I'm excited to join the conversation today.
And actually, as a former Siemens alum, I am quite sad that I didn't know that we worked on motorcycles or motorbikes or e-bikes at the time. I mean, is this a new development, Nand, or what? Like, I feel like Siemens is holding out on me in terms of this.
Well, as you know, Siemens is a very large corporation, depending on what area of Siemens you worked in. I think that's, you refer to as smart infrastructure. Well, Paul Musto, who was in the introduction, and we are from Siemens Digital Industry Software. So that's the other business unit of bigger Siemens. So we in that group, for our software services, which is product lifecycle management, we've always had these subsegments. As you know, we go to market by the industry, but as part of the automotive and transportation, those were the subsegments.
Excellent. Okay. And then Michael, why don't you round us out? Tell us what LA is doing on electric mobility. I know it's a lot, so keep it to the highlights.
Yes, definitely. Good afternoon. Thanks, Julia. Good to see you again, and good to be here with the rest of the esteemed panel. And I do want to acknowledge that while we get to the future, the beautiful future that Robin and Veronica were describing, unfortunately, I do have to work on attempting to electrify a fair amount of single occupancy vehicles and trucks and delivery equipment and things of that nature, so that we can at least help with our air quality and other issues. So in this role, I'm getting to work internally on our lead by example efforts with the city's fleets, and we do already have a large number of electric vehicles. Those are operational, so they're performing useful work for citizens. And then a lot of our external efforts, like the Blue LA program, which was brought up, and we are very excited with it. We do think it's been exemplary, and exemplary in good and bad ways. There's been a lot of learning lessons there that I hope other cities and areas around the country that have started up their own electric car shares could learn from us. And we're also learning as we go into our phase 2 of the program, which is going to see the deployment of another 60 stations, another 200 vehicles. But at the end of the day, very excited to be supporting shared and electric mobility that does fill that gap, because there are those times when people need to take their parents to the doctor or go shopping or whatever, when a bike or even an e-cargo bike won't meet the needs. So working on that. And then just briefly, we do have a universal basic mobility pilot going on through a STEP grant that the city was awarded from CARB, which includes numerous components, including an e-bike lending library, additions to the Blue LA program, and then with Metro, making sure that their tap card can basically get you onto any of these modes, so that you do have that mobility freedom, but also my new favorite term. So thank you, and we can move along.
infrastructure is destiny and mobility freedom. You heard it here first. Those will be the phrases, the catchphrases of this webinar at the very least. I want to talk about infrastructure. I know some people are like, infrastructure, what infrastructure? We don't care. It's kind of boring. But I actually think it's very interesting. And for that matter, when you're talking about e-mobility of any kind, it's going to require infrastructure investments. I remember before I joined the mayor's office in LA, when I was working at Siemens, I did an analysis of how many chargers LA would have to deploy per week from now through 2050 to electrify to 100%. And it was like 100 chargers a week. And then similarly, I was talking to some folks in Chicago about e-bikes in their bike share program, and getting an e-bike, like a charging station for e-bikes in Chicago was really challenging, required coordination across many departments, and took a long time to do. So Ali, I want to start with you, and I want to know from your vantage point, like, how are you thinking about what those infrastructure investments are, where they need to go, and who's responsible for making them?
Yeah, absolutely. So with our pilot currently, we are loaning the e-bikes to the participants who are either small businesses or independently contracted delivery drivers, with the intent to own the e-bikes. After the 6-month lease, they will have the options to purchase at a fairly reduced price. And with that said, the e-bikes are fairly accessible to them for those 6 months and thereon after, because they can charge it from their home. E-bikes chargers, they charge like any other laptop. And initially, this pilot was introduced to try to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in areas like Harbor area, where our pilot is currently located at, because they are impacted by multiple air pollutants, refineries, high traffic. So many of these folks don't have a lot of familiarity with bikes, not even e-bikes, because the current e-bike shared system is not available in their area, although it would make significant impacts to promoting increased bike usage. So to answer your question, and I want to touch a little bit about, the behavior here. We're trying to encourage people to use bikes, because once you get on a bike, it's when you realize how vital infrastructure is in improving your quality of life, improving the quality of how you get around your transportation. And I think it will call for greater advocacy around improving riding conditions in areas that need multiple modes of transportation, not just cars. So I think with increased usage of bikes, like pilots like ourselves, will encourage folks to learn about what types of infrastructure they can advocate for in their community. And we're already seeing that from our surveys, our weekly surveys that we conduct with the participants, that they're already experiencing what it is like to be a cyclist out in LA County. And one of the things that they are wanting to see in their community is this better infrastructure. So I think with more people joining the cycling community, we're going to see more people pushing our local and state officials to do something about this. And I just can't wait to see where we go after this pilot is completed.
Yeah, I love that. And I actually want to tease apart what you said, Ali, into 3 different components. So, when people think e-mobility, normally they probably are thinking of charging infrastructure, but what you're really saying is infrastructure is protected bike lane infrastructure, it's bike share stations. And I want to just point out one of my favorite examples right now in the e-bike space is what the city of Denver is doing with their e-bike voucher program. Mm-hmm. So they have subsidies between like $400 and $1,700 for people to get e-bikes and e-cargo bikes. And what they're finding is that the people who are getting those bikes, they're using them, and they're also using shared micromobility options. So having bike share stations, having shared micromobility in different places is actually supportive of people using more bikes, micromobility, even when it's privately owned. So Michael, I'm going to actually turn it to you next to talk about like the types of infrastructure investments you're thinking about. And again, this question of like, what are those investments? Where do they need to go? Who's responsible for making them? And even how do you think about phasing and iterating on the massive number of chargers that we're going to need?
Yeah, it's a the 100 chargers per week is probably even undercounting it that you mentioned before, given all of the commercial needs that there are out there to go to zero emission. It's really difficult, of course, and the city is not going to be the resolver of all the problems, but we're going to try and facilitate where we can and directly install where we can. So I just wanted to raise an example of our streetlight curbside EV chargers. So this is a program that the city of LA, I think, piloted first in the country. We had, a handful to begin with, and we actually now have approaching 600 curbside EV chargers. 600 level 2 chargers is not resolving our, electrification needs, but it's a really good first step. And the reason I mention it is they're quickly deployable. They don't require any breaking of concrete, and they just get strapped onto an existing piece of infrastructure. And furthermore, we can be discrete and specific in where we install them. So that means we can focus on areas that are in greater need for that. And again, to the point of what my colleagues on the call were saying earlier, this is not that we want to promote that people in low-income neighborhoods just move on to an electric vehicle, but I would rather, if they're going to have a vehicle, it be an electric vehicle than not. And if the EV charger is the sort of difference maker in making that decision, then the city wants to help them make that decision. So we are working specifically through the STEP grant to actually install more chargers in South LA right now than we do otherwise. So there's going to be additional chargers there. And then I do want to come back to the Blue LA program, which in addition to the expansion in the neighborhoods and around the neighborhoods where it currently is, we're going to start having locations in other destination parts of the city, which is going to make the system as a whole more useful. It's going to have more of a network effect, and it will allow the sort of home users, who live in the areas where most of the stations are, to be able to get further out and go to places where they might not otherwise feel comfortable going in this shared vehicle. So that's another way. In terms of other ways to accelerate, we're going to look at opening up our city properties to charging infrastructure and other infrastructure. For example, mobility hubs for general mobility, also delivery hubs to do last mile, delivery in zero emission micro mobility options, things of that nature. So, it's going to be an all hands on deck approach to let's throw things at the wall, see what works, and continue moving forward. So we're going to spend money, and hopefully most of it will be well spent. We will look to the state and the federal government for more and continue to try things out here.
We will spend money, and hopefully most of it will be well spent is a good way to summarize, I think, what we're all trying to do in new mobility, which is really to forge new ground and new territory. Nand, I'm going to ask you a slightly different version of this question, which is, what do you see as the role of software in infrastructure planning and, then the actual implementation, and finally making sure that infrastructure works and continues to work over time?
Well, back to software is playing a very important role in all aspects of our life. What we call as a connected devices in general. Is the trend, is a consumer trend. It's not only just your cell phone, but these connected devices, everything is being controlled by either embedded software or the application software. So when it comes to charging infrastructure, there's several aspects of it. One is in enabling the charging infrastructure from a design, development, testing, and validating, software is a predominant part in there. Then when we all talking about the e-mobility, immaterial of what mode it is in. If we pick cars as one of the modes, the battery management system itself is being run by software. Then when it's going to come down to charging infrastructures, then it's all the application software, which is going to help the consumers, the availability of those, the nearest locations, things of that nature. You could be doing that today with your Google apps and so on. There'll be dedicated apps created for the user convenience. And I think that's going to be very important in order for the infrastructure to be very effective with the user community, immaterial of what mode of transportation they are using. So software overall plays a very important role in all these different aspects.
Yeah, understood. And I think, sometimes is the thing that we don't think of, right? In terms of the importance of the software in combination with the hardware, which is, tangibly what we see. So I want to pivot a little bit and pick up on a thread that, Michael, you were talking about when you were talking about Blue LA and what the Blue LA program is, and then Alejandra, the programs and pilots that you're running too around e-bikes. How are you all thinking about how disadvantaged or vulnerable communities might benefit from electric vehicles or electric mobility, and what those types of benefits are? And Ali, maybe I'll start with you and ask, not only what might be the benefits, but also what are the risks or challenges? Like, how do you avoid this being something where folks feel like they're in test beds or the tech isn't good enough? And so really, starting to bear that burden of being the first adopters of something new.
Absolutely. So a part of our pilot, in order to participate in the pilot, the participants have to take an e-bike safety training course in which they learn basic bike safety skills, and they have an opportunity to demo the e-bikes so that they can determine at that time if that's something that's going to fit their needs. And that kind of clears up a little bit about the uncertainty of whether this new device, many of them unfamiliar with e-bikes, is something that's going to work for them. And I think that while a lot of the participants have shared that they were hesitant to try electric bikes, the benefits far outweigh those uncertainties, because they are seeing that they're more active because they're actively exercising while doing their deliveries, or just riding because they enjoy riding their bikes. They're saving money. And for a lot of the participants in our e-bike pilot, they come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So having an e-bike is already as accessible as it is through this pilot, is already a great benefit to them, because they wouldn't be able to utilize such a sustainable method to themselves otherwise. And yeah, they're saving fuel. We brought this pilot around the time when gas prices were skyrocketing, and I think it encouraged a lot of people to open their minds to utilizing e-bikes to do their deliveries, because they were so overly burdened by the gasoline prices, especially because it's sustainable for them to do electric. They don't have to waste so much money since they're running around doing running errands or deliveries on a daily basis. And lastly, I just really want to focus on the health benefit of this. San Pedro, Wilmington, and Harbor City are communities that have historically been underrepresented and are facing a lot of air pollution at the time. Like, the data on health outcomes in these communities because of the air and the food even that the folks are eating here is detrimental. So proposing cleaner air modes of transportation is just one step forward towards protecting our most needed communities. And my vision is that this pilot doesn't end in the harbor area, that is extended across other areas in LA County that are experiencing similar adversities.
Yeah, love that vision and love that idea of expansion. And I'm sure there's a few people, both as panelists and then also in the audience, who would like to see the same thing and be part of that movement. Michael, I want to know, when you think about, the projects that you're doing and how those might benefit different parts of LA and Angelenos, how do you also think about how organizations like LACBC and Urban Movement Labs and companies like Siemens can help you with that? Like, where are the places that government really needs help in terms of serving, again, some of the places where traditionally business might not go first?
That's an interesting question. We're in need of a lot of help in a lot of areas, so let me start by acknowledging that. And I think organizations like LACBC and other advocates are just beyond critical in being the drumbeat of changes needed, because it's absolutely correct that the bureaucracy is a big machine, or whatever analogy we want to use. It's a ship that's hard to redirect. And so when getting to the point of what the talk was happening earlier about infrastructure and bike lanes and land use and all of that, that stuff will not change without some very significant noise from the outside. Of course, we're working internally. We have lots of teams dedicated to trying to do new things and trying to move things forward in a different direction, but it is very hard, and pressure from the outside on the advocate side is beyond critical. You know, as much as it may scare us or hurt us or whatever, it is, you know, A1 priority. And then on the, you know, the business side, solutions, right? We're not going to invent all the solutions, but also partnership. Let's test things out. We're of course we're always doing that. You know, we're trying out cameras for enforcement and other things of this nature, or more quickly deployable makeshift or make ready infrastructure, you know, bike lanes and things of that nature. You know, the companies like Siemens or others can bring all sorts of solutions there that we may not be aware of. Or, hey, we're seeing now that you can actually, you know, make this thing you're doing work better, right? If you implemented this little tweak, or we have this little piece of technology. And I think there is a software and hardware component in that, where just information and, you know, like today I had some pictures sent to me of the abuse of one of our street light chargers. And I would love to not have a parking enforcement agent with a camera have to take that picture, but, you know, have some other way of quickly getting that information. So I think there's, you know, we all have to be in partnership here to get to where we want to go. So I'm hopeful that, you know, moving forward, there is going to be less car-centric focus and more of a let's get people where they need to go in the, you know, most low emission, convenient way possible.
Yeah, and that's a great sort of vision to take forward. Nand, I'm going to give you the last word before we invite back all the panelists and we go to audience Q&A. I mean, I think it is, you know, pretty incredible that Siemens has taken the stance of like looking, you know, across modes at sustainability and also at accessibility. So in your work, you know, how are you all trying to embed equitable outcomes through the software projects you're doing, through the way in which you're thinking about charging infrastructure and even just, you know, supporting these other modes of transportation?
Yeah, we think overall transportation revolution, things are shifting away from just going from point A to point B to more of a human-centric and overall user experience. So having said that, by definition, then mobility becomes a multimodal. So in other words, it has to suit to the human needs of what's needed. I think many people have said that in many different ways, that's the multimodal, whether it's planes, trains, and automobiles. And when it comes to within the city, whether it's e-bikes, e-scooters, e-rickshaws, if we start talking globally, many different modes of transportation. So we are here through our software products and the solutions to help exactly what Michael said. Give us a problem statement. And one thing is another very clear in my experience, there's no single company or organization which can solve these problems alone. So there's a huge amount of partnerships at all levels between companies, between, in fact, sometimes competitive companies, and also technology companies and infrastructure companies going in place to solve the bigger problem, which is human-centric mobility. And when we talk about mobility, today we are focused on the cities and people movement. I think it's equally applicable to movement of goods, whether it's movement of goods from the shipyard in LA, how many things are stuck there since the pandemic. You know, things are not got back to normal, whether it's the moving of goods, last mile delivery, what we call. And I think Ali's projects look like addressing some of those things through e-bikes. So I think it's movement of goods is part of that transportation system. And that's where we get excited about that Siemens wants to deliver these solutions, obviously with sustainability in mind, because that's what we do in our factories. And that's what the solutions we want to provide our customers and the cities.
Fantastic. Well, those are great words to end this part of the discussion on. So thank you, Nand, Alejandra, and Michael for this wonderful discussion on electric mobility. I'm going to say a few things as we get the rest of the panelists pinned up here with us, so you can see us all at one time. It looks like we've had fantastic interaction on the whiteboard. So we will be sharing a synthesis of what was written on that whiteboard after this workshop. We also have had some really good Q&A from the audience, some of which looks like it's specifically directed towards a person, like will Blue LA continue to be available using a tap card? And so for those questions, I'm actually going to direct them to the panelists to answer after the panel itself and after the workshop itself, and maybe focus in on just one final question for you all to discuss before I thank everybody for participating and share what's next for UML. So I'm going to go with this question. As Alejandra mentioned, infrastructure for active and shared mobility is key to the future of sustainable mobility. How do we build coalitions to communicate the benefits of multimodal roadway designs, which elected officials have been hesitant to adopt? And I'm going to do this lightning round. And you're just going to get 2 sentences, and they're not allowed to have too many ands or semicolons or commas between the sentences. And let me go with Alejandra first.
So get the community involved. I want to add to the chat our blog on the e-bike pilot because it highlights who the leaders in this effort were that made it a success. And that is LA Walk's Safe Street Community Promotores. Because when you get community members involved in advocating for an issue, they get that buy-in from the community and they will be successful. So who better to engage the community than the community itself?
Beautiful. Nand, what do you think?
Make it a part of the ballot. Let's get if there's a resistance for offering those roads, the officials mentioned in there, I'm sure elected officials are the ones getting input. They are serving this community in theory. So we got to take some actions so that they can hear our voices, what people want.
Wonderful. Veronica.
I think it's 2-part. One is elevating the benefits that infrastructure for all delivers in terms of safety, but also in terms of economic reinvestment. We saw during the pandemic, shared streets that were dedicated to outdoor dining, spaces for communities performed better economically. So it's elevating those safety and economic benefits and then building those partnerships, coalitions that include community stakeholders like Ale mentioned, but also Chamber of Commerce, all of them together to advocate for those changes.
Michael.
What Veronica just said.
That's usually my response too. Robin.
All of the above, plus we need to expand the tent, and I feel like we underestimate the power and joy of not having to drive 14 to 17-year-olds around and people who don't own cars. So I'd like to see more youth press. I don't have a car and I'm trapped. Please build more infrastructure for me. And the moms should get on board.
Mobility freedom. Well, fantastic. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists, to Siemens for the partnership, and to everybody for joining us. As I mentioned at the start, this event is the first of 3 virtual workshops, and then we're going to have 1 in-person workshop in December. The next event is coming up very quickly. So on October 18th at 12 noon, we're going to have an event on advanced air mobility. If you want to learn more, sign up for the event. The link is in the chat, but you can also follow Urban Movement Labs on Twitter or join our mailing list to receive updates. So thank you, thank you, thank you again. So wonderful to see you all and to speak with you all and to be part of this movement together. Thanks and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Julia.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
Thanks, UML and Siemens. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.